Aloha, aloha mai kako. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it, but a couple of things. I'm not the founder. I was a kid when the Hokulea was launched, and I'm just a student of extraordinary teachers. And so I was asked to talk about a story about the Black Road of Extinction and how it would be transformed to Renaissance in Hawaii, in the Pacific. So I'll warn you guys, it's late. I got way too many slides. It's an old story, but and it's very personal. I'm not a public speaker, and I'm really nervous right now. I'd be better off if you turn all the lights off. I'm better in the dark. And I got to get someone to handle the slides. Maybe we get the first slide on. Is this it? Oh, okay. Okay, they're getting the slides ready in a minute. So, I'm born and raised in the middle of the ocean, in the biggest ocean on the planet, called the Pacific, in the Hawaiian Islands. And and I maybe at a time when things Hawaiian weren't valued, and you most understood it and felt it in what we taught in our schools. So just before the slides come up, to give you some framework about Renaissance, I would graduate from high school, and there would be, of 13 years K-12, there'd be a half a semester as an elective, Hawaiian history that began at Kamehameha I, ended at modern day, and have no idea who my ancestors are, and where did they come from, and how did they get to this single most isolated high island archipelago on the earth, if the ocean is isolation. It depends how you look at it, your worldview. And so I would graduate from high school, no idea, no connection, no relationship. And I would graduate with a sense of rage that even though we didn't talk about it in society, everything, when it's not valued about who you are, you feel it. And then you read it in the statistics, whether their health or their education or you die younger than most, you're going to prognose to fail first and succeed less. And the thing about education, you're prognosed that you're not going to do well. And that is chronic. And what was the worst about it was we didn't talk about it. So the notion about talking about extinction, we know what it feels like, we know what it smells like. And so this story that I'm about to talk to you about is about those extraordinary pioneers that really shifted everything in Hawaii, in the Pacific, and just imagine if Planetary Health could do that globally. That's the challenge. The other thing about graduation was, and I believed it, that in our school, the big global issue was food and poverty, and that could be solved. It was a matter of not access to food, it was a matter of distribution. And that the notion was that the oceans has an infinite amount of protein that can feed humanity forever. Wrong. 90% of the big fish are gone. And we will be much more people in mid-century, maybe close to 11 billion, 10 billion. So this presentation, once we get the slides, is really about taking a look at this Renaissance, and can we now start on the greatest voyage of humankind of all time. Save the earth to save ourselves. And maybe we'll have the slides pretty soon, otherwise I'm running out of things to talk about. But you guys got any questions? Well, I don't know, but I do know that it starts with coming together. I do know that the voyage has to be global. I do know it needs to be navigated by the kinds of values that are inclusive, that invites everyone to be a part of the solution, nobody left out. I do know that the planetary health framework is like, and I'm not all that informed, is the best framework I have seen that has vision, that talks about a destination, believes in it, that's going to be good enough for the world. And I will talk about the rest later. So, this presentation about extinction starts with the island, the only one we got. Next slide. I'm going to go quick because you guys are tired. And this is where I was born and raised in the middle of the sea, these origin of these islands coming from the bottom of the sea, volcanism, miracles, that it would be calculated that to get a single species to make the voyage across 2,000 miles of ocean would take 200,000 years per species. But Hawaii, over millions of years, to become the most rich, ecological, diverse place on the planet. What we're going to talk about is another diversity. Next slide. About the first human footprint on the sand in Hawaii. We're guessing. It was about maybe around the time of Christ, around that time. A voyaging canoe came from isles in the south. And that voyage would have to be at least 2,300 miles long. Open ocean, no landfall in between. And we do know that, we want to believe that those voyages were, in many ways, the greatest feat of exploration, navigation, and courage and exploration of all time, in that time. And but we forgot. Stuff happened that took away that history, so when you graduate from high school, you know nothing. But that's one of the great geniuses, was the art and the courage and the science and navigation. The other genius, I think, that's relative to the notion of Renaissance is the next slide. Native Hawaiians figured it out. Captain Cook arrived 1778. He writes in the logbook, in the journals of this people in these isolated islands that were strong, that they were intelligent, that they were healthy people. There was no obesity. And he put Lieutenant Bligh, who would be Captain Bligh later on the tip of the southern tip of the Big Island to do a census on population. And the guess that time, and it's really debatable, take a median of all the debate, it's about 800,000 Native Hawaiians living fully sustainable on these islands and in a rich, healthy way. So, Native people either cracked the code or you died. Either or. What we know is that in the 13th century, things would change. That they weren't the best stewards of their land. That by the 13th century, we know there were population crashes due to not enough food to feed their people. We know in the 13th century that things would change. They would introduce the kapu system, which is a very strict set of rules and laws about the relationship and the kinship between people and place. In Hawaii, you could only live in 17% of the land. The other 83% was kapu to the gods in the watersheds. The whole thing about sustainability was following the water. Water was wealth. If you look into the languages, the word vai means water. Everything defines wealth. Follow the water. It's about the water. And then in the 13th century, another thing would change. Voyaging would stop. The whole focus was their relationship to the lands and the oceans. Voyaging stopped. Then the other thing that would change in 1778, next slide, that other voyagers from other parts of the world brought different things. One was disease that Hawaiians were not resistant to. Stories change. And there was a study by the Kamehameha schools that suggests in the next 28 years, after 1778, 75% of the 800,000 died. Stories change that on the island of Maui, they couldn't find enough sand to bury the dead lying down, so they buried them standing up. Then 100 years later from that, you'd be down to 22,000. 1 out of 37 would make it. The rest would perish. Land, sovereignty, everything, culture, language was being taken away. The black road of extinction is being well paved in Hawaii. There is a miracle, and this is what I was asked to talk about, the Renaissance. Renaissance is the word defined by those in Hawaii about the shift and change. Next slide. It begins with this man. And when I bring them into the room, it's important because these are really heroes of ours in Hawaii. This is not my story. I was there, young, just hanging on to their coattails and following the dream. Dr. Ben Finney, surfer from Santa Barbara, loved the ocean, did not like what he saw about how they were trying to define the peopling of Polynesia, the biggest nation on the earth, 10 million square miles, larger than Russia. So he came to Hawaii in his postdoctorate in 1958. The genesis of voyaging, the resurgence of voyaging began when he came to Honolulu, went to the University of Hawaii. A woman professor by the name of Catherine Luamala, and you could count the women professors on one hand in the university back then, would hand them 2 books and said, these books are wrong, change them. And they were Thor Heyerdahl, Kon-Tiki, wrong. And the other one's by Andrew Sharp, one a well-known anthropologist from New Zealand, who said, no, they had voyaging canoes, not driftwood rafts from the Americas, but they didn't have the intelligence to navigate more than 100 miles. Therefore, anything like a Hawaii arrival was because they were in a storm. The mathematical probability of having a storm take you across the equator is 0. And so Ben Finney was the one. Santa Barbara, not Hawaii. Santa Barbara. And he takes 10 years to read these books and think things through about the dream of Renaissance, and then he makes a phone call, next slide, to this man, Herb Kabainui Kane, arguably the greatest artist in modern times. He was a sculptor, he was a painter, and he was a historian. He did enormous amounts of research. But when Ben made the phone call, the single phone call that would change everything, it was answered in Chicago, where Herb was selling his art. I always ask them, how come you didn't call Hawaii? And they say, who would answer the phone? Who would understand what we're trying to do? The gap of ignorance was so huge. So these 2 men, the scientists, the artists, came together and they started to dream together. Culture and science coming together in a powerful way. Next slide. Then they would remap the Pacific for us. That is my ancestral home, the triangle in the middle of the ocean, Hawaii, New Zealand, Rapa Nui Easter Island, 10 million square miles. Exclude the landmass of New Zealand with all due respect. Add up the total square miles of the rest of the islands. Even though it's 3 times the size of the continental United States, you could fit all those islands in 1/3 the state of New York. It's an ocean place. And it was all these islands were discovered. The question was how. And even to make it more complex, we know today that Austronesian speaking, the root language in Polynesia is the same names of rivers and streams and mountains in Madagascar behind this screen. And then there's also now the debate, for sure, they went to the Americas. Now there's a debate when we were in Cuba, they were showing us linguistic similarities to say they actually crossed the peninsula. I don't know. 15 time zones if you accept that. Next slide. But the only way you could do it was to build the vehicle, the spaceship of our ancestors. This took an awful lot of work with some really brilliant people to try to figure out, because there are no blueprints, there's no drawings. There's some old sketches by Spanish explorers that didn't really care. And so there was nothing technical, but they came together. And this is a day before they would launch the first Voyaging canoe, the first vehicle, on March 8th, 1975, from the beach of Kualoa. I was there. No founder, I was just hanging out and following the dream. And it was a rough one. Real quick, I know you guys got to go. They would launch it on Saturday. We would sail it on Sunday. We didn't know where to put a sheet line. We didn't even know what a sheet line was. And so we just made 40 half hitches on a piece of wood. And off we would go with these two big sails that are, now we know they're poorly designed, in this sacred beach of Kualoa into the bay called Kaneohe. Ran aground with about 35 people onto a sandbar. Went aground. The sheet lines were tied, and the captain said, everybody get off the canoe. So we all jumped off into the sandbar. Guess what? The canoe lifts up. It's fully sailed, and off it goes by the captain by himself. I was going, whoa, this is going to be a long voyage. And but my point is, we knew nothing. Next slide. Tevake, he was the last. Herb researched all of the Pacific to find the great Polynesian navigators. Last person, Tevake, island of Santa Cruz, Melanesia proper, outlier. Sent a team down to go talk to Tevake to see if he would come and navigate a canoe to places they've never been to that hasn't even been constructed yet. And the team went down, to make a long story short, they came back without a commitment. Herb Connie receives a letter about 6 months later from Tevake's granddaughter saying that one day he got up, said goodbye to the family, went into the canoe house, took a small canoe out to sea by himself, never came back. We know extinction. We know what it feels like. He's the last. He's gone. We know what it smells like. Next miracle. Next slide. Long debates. The leadership's going to navigate by themselves, having no idea how much they don't know. Very dangerous on the ocean. A Peace Corps worker by the name of Mike McCoy comes to a leadership meeting. I wasn't there. I'm not in leadership. And says, hey, you want a navigator? He's 5 miles down the road. He's staying on a ship called the Thompson Cromwell, a research ship for the University of Hawaii, teaching scientists how to catch tuna with traditional lures. His name is Piailug. They call him Mao. Mao means strong. Mao means fierce. He's a master navigator. I heard that they went and talked to him about, will you navigate this canoe that's not constructed? Will you sail it across the equator to stars you'll never seen before? And you lose a North Star? And will you be with a crew that's not selected? And your voyage will be 8 times longer than any one voyage you ever made before? And this canoe is 6 times bigger than yours. And he said yes. Broken English. Could barely speak English. The obvious is he's a courageous man. He's a navigator. But I know my time with Mao. Mao, the genius of Mao, he knew he don't come, Hawaiians will fail. And that maybe they'll never, ever have a chance to go voyage again. So he comes, make a long story short, he did 2 amazing things for the Pacific. Next. One, he would take us to the island. This is an island called Satawal. He's not from Polynesia, he's from Micronesia. The island is 1.25 miles long. You could probably fit 20 of them in Stanford. And a half-mile wide. And the highest soil is 8 feet. Well, it used to be 8 feet. No lagoon. So the colonial powers of the Spanish and the Germans and the Japanese and the Americans had no interest in Satawal because there was no military value. Left it alone. Left the school alive. And this is our school. where all the Genesis goes back to. This place where when I asked the chiefs, how old is the school? They said 3,000 years. How many navigators are chained on this train is on? He said at least 1,000. Next slide. Okay, Hawaii's up on the top left. Tahiti, the target is down in the middle bottom. Next slide. That's all you got to do is follow the blue line and you'll get there. Into the world's two biggest consistent wind system, the northeast trade and southeast trade winds. And where they collide and there's high evaporation rates on the equator, you have the cloudiest and rainiest place on the earth called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. Europeans call it the doldrums for the spells of the wind. Very, very cloudy and very difficult to navigate through without any instruments. And next slide, quickly. And they would go. Mao was on board, the leader, the navigator. First voyage in 600 years. And I wasn't on the voyage, but I watched it go, the confusion in our communities. There were those who prayed for this canoe to be successful. There were those who just didn't care because it was Hawaiian and it has no value. And I had the sense that there was those that feared this canoe would be successful, because if it is, it's going to change everything. Whose Renaissance are we talking about? Next slide. 31 days later, arrival, Papeete. Miracle. Imagine you're standing on Waikiki Beach and look at the left side with your imagination of Tahiti, and the right side is less than 1 degree. And then go find it with nature only. The genius of Mao. Everything changed. Renaissance began on this day. There were 17,000 Tahitians there. It's more than half the population. I flew down as a member of the crew to take the canoe back from Tahiti, and it's a long story. I had to climb the monkey paw tree to see the canoe come in because there were so many Tahitians there. Then we had to go ask the children to please get off the canoe because so many were getting on. They were kind of sinking the stern, and we had to protect our home and in English, and they spoke the old native language, and everything was changing. Next slide. The second miracle of this man, he would come back for 30 years and train us. 3 decades. Train us. And if indigenous knowledge has value into the depth, into the magic of the relationship and kinship to nature, he's the guy. The things that I saw him do and understand in connections is beyond imagination. He knows stuff without knowing how he knows, but he knows. And that's that relationship to nature. And he would come and train us, and next slide. He'd let us go. Find our way. Find yourself along the way. Next slide. And then we would make 13 voyages to the Pacific through a whole bunch of years, and Mao was there to help, but Mao would have the debilitating disease called diabetes that it would take his legs and take his eyes, and too weak to sail. And next slide. Renaissance, I define it this way. It changed laws in Hawaii. It changed policies of big institutions. The Department of Education would not allow Hawaiian language or culture practice in schools at all. My grandmother would be beaten by teachers who had the authority to take a stick to you for dancing or for speaking her first language. Hawaiian language is first language now. Hawaiian culture competence is a graduation requirement. Every school in Hawaii is shifted. You cannot anymore dredge a coral reef, fill it into a fish pond, and make it into a really exclusive gated community for the rich anymore. Beachfront property. You can't do that. We have laws against that. You cannot take water from the streams anymore, like we did before, to divert water from our communities to water our thirsty golf courses. You can't do that anymore. And these things about issues that go on and on about Hawaiian culture, the thing that was most important It changed identity. It changed sense of self-worth and self-dignity. When I would be with my grandmother when I was a child, she'd talk about her uncle would take lye and rub the brown off his skin. Now, we raise flags. Now, we have bumper stickers and T-shirts about pride. It's that issue where everybody is included, everybody is valued. That's why I'm so honored to be a part of the values of what you people are doing. Next. But then there would be Apollo 8, 68. William Anders would believe the gravitation of the Earth and go around the moon 10 times and take the first photograph of Earthrise. We all know this. And would be what some would say would be the genesis of the global environmental movement worldwide. Because we're seeing the whole island, and it's blue, by the way. And next slide. It would inspire this man. It's very emotional for me, because he's my best friend. Keikioka Aina, he's from the land in Hawaii. Ku'aina, he stood to fight for it in his way. He graduated, went to the Air Force, flew Vietnam, shot down the second day behind enemy lines, lands in some river, doesn't die. He'd be the commander and the lead pilot for the Thunderbirds, the most elite, one of the most elite flight teams in the world, the lead. And his name is Lieutenant Colonel Lacey Veach. He was my hero because he was a great explorer, because he'd be the second astronaut from Hawaii to go into space. And I wasn't going to tell you this, but he was so heroic that when I would go do a slide presentation for elementary school kids, you go into the classroom, you'd have a 6-foot cardboard picture of him stuck on the wall in his spacesuit. And when I talked to the student about who is that, everybody knew who he was. The lieutenant colonel, the astronaut. And then, by chance, in 1991, there was this thing in Honolulu, it's called the Waikiki Shell. It's like this open-air place where they would have concerts and so forth. And his high school was honoring all these important alumni, and they would get up and say how cool they were and inspire everybody. And Lacey would be the last, he'd be the keynote. And so back then, high security, I just went over there, parked my car, jumped over the fence, the chain link fence, and then went in the back door of this place where they have all those curtains that are on the stage, those kind of curtains. So I hid in the curtains, waiting for my hero to come. And sure enough, he shows up in this white limousine, 5 doors, shouldn't be on the road, white tuxedo, black tie, Type A fighter pilot, walks right by me, and I just watched him, standing ovation, and then he walks right by me back into the limousine. And true story, that was a Friday night. True story. I get a phone call at 6:30 in the morning, and the next morning it was the governor's office. The governor, he doesn't even know who I am. Why would he call? Why would they call? It wasn't for me. And the guy, the staff person goes, "Hey, Lieutenant Colonel Lacey Veach wants to go sailing with you guys today." Because we were training for a trip to Rarotonga Cook Islands. I had no idea how they knew. I don't know how Lacey knew. And I said, okay, nervously, I told him, just tell him to come down at 9 o'clock, because I know my crew is coming down at 8 o'clock. Because I got to talk to the crew. My hero's coming. You guys got to, put a T-shirt on and some slippers and do the best you can about speaking good English today, because I don't know if he's going to understand you guys. And so they're just average local people. And true story, Lacey Veach shows up, not in the white limousine, but his mom's old DeSoto, rusted. Gets out of the car, he's barefoot, his shorts are ripped, and no T-shirt. And so the astronaut gets on the canoe, and we're don't know what to say. Is that really uncomfortable silent moment where the hero, gets on, and nobody's greeting him. Nobody knows what to say. And then he rubbed the rail of Hokulea. And then he turned to us and said, he goes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because today I'm going to understand what the real power of exploration is. Thank you for bringing me here. And I just turned back, I leaned back and just said, this guy is one way or another is going to be like best friend. And so we did some pretty crazy stuff. Next slide. Yeah, so just by chance, he was going to be in STS-52. His schedule was just by chance going to be when we were coming back from Rarotonga. By chance. The schedules were same time. So he loved Hokulea. Next slide. We're going to real fast. So he's flying. And then before that, he would, it's a long story, but he would steal his radio out of his fighter in Ellington Field, get some engineer to illegally hook it up in the shuttle. I don't know how you do that. And then because, next slide, he had this education program that NASA wouldn't endorse, but he did it anyway. And where we could talk to each other. He's going 6 miles a second. We're going 4 miles an hour. He goes around the Earth 90 minutes. We get home. It takes us 2 months to get home from Rarotonga. And but we had 6 minutes when the antennas see each other. And so we had this education program set up in Hawaii with 35,000 school kids. And the problem is our equipment is so old. It's a single sideband. There was no satellite phones back then. So you got to bounce it off the signal off the atmosphere. If it bounces wrong and doesn't get the antennas, you're talking to nobody. And so we called Honolulu in this 6-minute window. Nobody answers. And then we called Rarotonga, this guy Stuart Kingman's, whose antenna fell down 10 years before that in the bushes, never put it back up. He was this private ham operator. And the bushes grew over the antenna, and the signal was crystal clear. So that he sent it by phone to Pasadena. Lacey's signal went to Houston. It went there, they mixed it, and they sent it back to the 35,000 school kids. Next slide. And what he was trying to do is get children to understand the power of exploration is the pathway to create change. You have to be active. You can't sit back. You got to explore. Next slide. And then this is a slide. He goes, hey, I know, I'm going to bring a present back from space. And it was this picture. Try to examine it. Cockpit window of Columbia, edge of the Earth on the top. In the bottom right is the island of Hawaii. That little red dot you can kind of see, that's Mauna Kea. At the 12,500-foot elevation is a place called Keanakakoi, the caves of the Adzes. And so that's where this sub-freezing temperature every night. Native Hawaiians would be up there. 35,000 years ago, that island was covered by glacier. So lava came up, super cold, and made this very dense rock, the second best of the greenstone in New Zealand. That stone was given to Lacey by his grandfather. That is the head of the adze that's used to carve canoes, voyaging canoes. So he somehow smuggles heavy, sharp object, zero gravity, puts it in the window because he was the most optimistic person I knew in the world. And he's going to change everything in voyaging quick. And he says, yeah, we got to figure out all the world's problems. Let's look at our ancestry 500 years backwards, and let's look 500 years forward and use science and technology to get us. It's the merger of science and tradition, history and culture. And then he said, but you have to have the right values to navigate science. And so he didn't really believe it. And I'll tell you why. Next slide. One day out of the year, we block a calendar day. That day is kapu. Nobody can touch it. I'll meet you in Hilo. We rent a car illegally, go from Hilo up to the black lava of Mauna Loa at 6,000-foot elevation, sleep on the rocks. And there's no sleeping, but we go on the black lava where absorbs all light, bring stars close, dream. And we would talk about the commitment that Hokulea and the shuttle has to merge together those two worlds and find another way to have children explore within their culture and within the power of science and technology. Next slide. But when the subject would go to the Earth, Lacey would just get so upset that what we're doing to the planet that I physically would have to hold him and stop him because he could not figure out the pathway to solve the sail plan that humanity is on in its relationship to the Earth. So he is a scientist also. He knows what was happening to the Earth. I didn't understand it back in 91 and in 92. I didn't understand it, but I knew he did. And so he loved the planet. He understood it, its beauty, its infinite, complex thing called ecology and the fabric of life. And he knew he needed to be protected. And we knew we're going to drive ourselves in a really terrible place if we stay disconnected. Next slide. And then he would say, I know you cannot protect what you don't understand. And he would say, and you won't protect if you don't care, values, and you can't do it by yourself. And then he would say, you need to go. You need to take Hokulea around the world. He said, because we are changing the Earth, this is back in 91 and 92, it's changing us back then, and we don't know what to do. Then he would say, you need to take Hokulea around the Earth because you have the obligation to understand the Earth. You have the obligation to make connection with the people. And the question that he asked, I think, is so ingrained in the fabric of Planetary Health Alliance, is that this issue of culture. He said, there is a different culture on the Earth today. It's not about racism. It's not about the divisions of the color of your skin. It's not about the boundaries of geography or nationalism. It's about values. And that the question that we have before us, that you need to find out when you go around the world, is the culture of humanity still kind and compassionate enough to make the change? Fundamental question he would raise. This is why I gravitate to all of you, because you allow that to happen. Next slide. The Surgeon General wouldn't pick it up. A mole on his back. A multi-million-dollar trained pilot. Nobody saw it. By the time they diagnosed him with lymphomelanoma, he was stage 4. It was late September 1995, and his wife in Houston, Alice, would call me. Get on the plane today, Nainoa. You need to come today. I fly to Houston the next day. I go to Lacey's house, it's dimly lit. 100 people in it. Sad. There's no Lacey. I go to Alice's wife and say, well, where is he? And he's in the bedroom. He's waiting for you. So I go in to the bedroom and he goes, hey, get me out of here. These guys are making me so depressed, and I'm going to get through this. But he was so heavy with liquid that he couldn't walk. And so I wheeled him out in the wheelchair, and everybody, we go to the front door. He goes, hey, no, you know what? I need to walk. You need to carry me. I'm a small guy. He's a big guy. And so, okay, we'll go. And we walked down. You know how the sidewalk has the road, the curb, the grass, and then that strip of cement, the sidewalk. He was heavy, and his foot slipped off the sidewalk, and he fell. So I kind of turned myself quickly to get underneath him to break the fall. He lands right on top of me. I'm out of air, gasping for air, because I knocked it out of me. And he's just laughing. He thought that's the funniest thing on the planet. And I'm barely alive. And then he stops and he goes, this is about the power of the dreamer and the believer. Planetary health shifts us from that uncomfortable feeling of just being hopeful to believing. Believing we can do it, because we don't have a choice. Lacey was that way. That's why I'm telling you this story. He stops and he's like, quiet. And he goes, do you hear that? I didn't hear anything. And then he goes, no, do you hear it? And there's this tiny roar of a jet engine. He tells me the make of the aircraft plus the type of engine. And then he goes, and I know, show me Jupiter. So I grabbed his hand and pointed out to the sky to show him Jupiter. He goes, yeah, I see it. The problem with that, it was daytime and Lacey was blind. But it's the power of believing no matter what the odds are. That's planetary health. And I've been around the world. Kind of know. We lose him in 6 days. But he goes back to the house and he tells me two things. You got to go, Nainoa. And make the promise right now that you're going to go. Take Hokulea around the world. I said, okay. Then he said, you promise me you're going to take care of the island, the earth. I said, okay. We lose him. Next slide. 13 years, I'm going to go fast so you don't have time. 13 years, we would go back, leadership would get together, every annually in Hawaii, all the Voyaging leaders would get together, would all talk about the power of going around the world, the vision, really amazing. And once we start talking about hurricane or pirate or mosquito or violence or disease or rogue wave of South Africa, every time the vote is no. But the thing that Lacey left with me 6 days before he died was, you need to pay attention to the language of the earth. What are we talking about? Climate change, hypoxia, dead zones, all the stuff that we're dealing with today. That long list. Back in 1992, it was just a list. 13 years go by, and that language is screaming at us. Every time we voted no, because we were too afraid to go. It was too dangerous. April 1st, 2008. We're all together. We're going to take the vote, but the vote's different. The language is screaming at us, and we got to go. It's once you put your children in your vision and the future, you got to go. The question before us of the leadership was, what's more dangerous? The hurricane? The pirate? The mosquito? The rogue wave? Or staying tied to the dock and do nothing when you knew? We voted 4 times. Had to be unanimous. I saw young people courageous, afraid, but they know they need to go. It's the greatest moment with fear, when you're afraid and you still go. We voted. Next slide. You can kick me off anytime you guys want. I got plenty more. I'll go quick. Hokulea, we had to refurbish her. She was tired. We pulled her out of the water. It was 18 months, 64,000 man-hours of volunteer time. To get her restored next. We train the young navigators. Extraordinary. That have their native language now. Do you know that one of the changes in 1985 is only 100 speakers in Native Hawaiian? Now there's 25,000. These young are powerful, grounded in who they are, proud of who they are, and then they know how to navigate. They can leave home, but they know how to come back, and they're educated. Watch out. Next. Hikianalia will be the second canoe we build. We launched it in New Zealand. We tried, and it didn't work. To use electric engines with no carbon footprint. It sailed half of the voyage with us as an ESCO boat, but many of the places were too dangerous, so we couldn't use her. Next. Yeah, we had a crew of 327 crew members that would go 1,000 miles or more from 18 different countries. Next, I'm going to go quick. Yeah, this is a sail plan. It would be 42,000 miles. It would be 18 countries. It would be 327 ports. It was extraordinary. It seems long, but it wasn't long enough. We had so much to learn. Next. And then we would leave, head west until you went around the globe. Next. We'd navigate the old way by our teachers about half the time, and then when it was too dangerous, we'd use modern instruments and the best of technology, keep us safe. Next. Tahiti was our first stop to get ancestral permission to do something crazy like that. Next. We'd pick up and take sailing Secretary General of the United Nations, and he would sign a logbook next, and he'd put a personal note in the bottle saying that he will get the 127 nations to do what they can to protect the oceans. And then next, Aotearoa, next. Manaya Kalani is a star line name that we use to teach children the stars. The Maoris borrowed it and used it for grounding these children from the poorest of all the districts in the whole nation of Aotearoa. 11 schools, 2,400 students came down, grounded in their culture and their language, and borrowing it from Hawaii and teaching them technology and linking the two together. These are going to be great leaders from the poorest of all of that whole country. Next. Australia, next. It's an extraordinary slide. We would go up to the Great Barrier Reef. 320 schools, elementary schools, that have a highly, highly clear, defined purpose of schools. What is the purpose of schools? They're clear that these 35,000 school kids, K through 6, they take you by your finger, a little kindergarten, and takes you into where they're regrowing corals, where they're regrowing algae, where they're taking care of the wounded seabird or the sea turtle. Their school is defined by one single purpose, that they are going to protect and regain the health of the most largest and oldest single ecological system on the earth, called the Great Barrier Reef. Imagine if we did that to all schools. And I see the Planetary's held strategic things of changing schools from industrial-based education to one of nature. Next slide. Yeah, we went to some amazing places, Ashmore Reef. Next slide. Did some kind of crazy dives. It's a whole nother long story. We're not going to even go into it, but we didn't die. And but we went to places like this. Next. You can walk on the plastics. In Indonesia, you can walk on it. Looks like a road. You don't need to go to the great garbage patch. You just need to go to our communities. It's everywhere. Next slide. Africa, problem. No Panama Canal. You can go north, pretty awesome. You can go by Somalia and Yemen and the Red Sea and all the violence in there, and then you have this scenario, the conflicts in the Mediterranean, or you can go south around the most notoriously dangerous waters in the world, has the highest incidence of rogue waves, that if you're in the rogue wave, the problem with the rogue waves, we now have scientifically, we know what the ingredients are, but we can't predict them. We're 3 feet off the water. Our board of directors in Bali was saying, hey, no, it's too dangerous. Just ship the canoe from Indonesia to Brazil. And I was thinking, okay, on somebody's ship, and some captain we don't know, you put this canoe, this sacred vessel of our people. So I said, okay, you guys are the board, whatever, I serve you. But you make me do this, I quit. Because What you're essentially telling us that these crew members that trained 6 years, are not good enough. And you're also saying Hawaii is not good enough. And then what are you going to tell the children? That we changed the sail plan. We shipped it around the place that we're supposed to be challenged the most. I quit. So I said, just let me try. We can do this. And so we did. Next slide. Yeah. And it's not a long story, but we went to Mozambique when they didn't know. We had a running away from a storm. It was like pretty wild. Madagascar was so rough. It was unbelievable. But next slide. It was like a really rough trip, but it was the shortest distance, but the longest voyage. We went 900 miles in 61 days because we kept hiding from cold fronts. But we had the best meteorologists from India, from South Africa, from Atlantic, from Hawaii, that would just pave the way for us, and we took pilots with us. It was an amazing experience. Next slide. Cape Town. We were good enough. I say that with all humility, because you have to raise the bar. There is no time to be average anymore. There's no time to even be normal anymore. The bar's got to go up. And fear is a part of it. Cape Town, next slide. You guys can go, but I just want to take some time for this story. There was this man, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that would come to Hawaii 2013, the year before he departed, and blessed Hokulea. He's sick and said, if you come, I promise, I'll come to your arrival. In 2015, in November, mid-November, when we got there to Cape Town, he had not made a single public appearance. But when we arrived at the ceremony, he came. They had a tent. It was hot. They put a couch on the, and they had these blankets, and they had pillows, and he was dressed in a coat, and he had this, not that hat on, he had this fur hat over his head. They laid him down on the bed and on the couch, and they said, I'm really sorry, but he's not going to speak today because he's sick. And I said, we're just totally honest, he's here. And so we're giving these speeches, and we brought children from our public school, our charter school, and from our private schools to come honor him at Cape Town. And they were there with their pahu, their native drums. And then there were the African children, a fraction of the 40 million that he carried on his back for 40 years by himself, sitting on the curb with a cracker can as a drum. And some African girl went up and asked the Hawaiian girl, can I borrow your drum? And the girl said, of course. Then she started beating that drum. While all these speeches are going on, she started beating that drum. And then more drums started beating in. And all the African children were in the streets dancing. Then they grabbed, next slide. Then they grabbed the Hawaiian children, made a giant circle, and brought them all in together. One people, one ocean, one drum. So I'm trying to give my speech, and the lady comes up and goes, no, you got to turn around and take a look. When I turn around, it's like, the great warrior, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, was dancing with children in the streets. That was everything. I knew no matter how hard this voyage is, it is now worth it. Dancing in the streets with children. Next slide. We would choose the Everglades over Miami. Nature would be the first photograph we would take when we entered the continental United States. Next slide. Go to my best friend's home. See where he slept, when he trained, where he dreamed, where he believed. My mentor, next slide. Keep my promise. Next slide. New York, next slide. take back the bottle, give it to the United Nations with 18 countries devoted to protection of the oceans. Gave it to the Secretary General. Next slide. We'd go north to Nova Scotia. Next slide. We'd go up the Hudson for about 900 miles and go over 2 mountain ranges through 62 locks to get into the Great Lakes. Kind of tight squeeze. Next slide. Our last lock was in Panama. Next slide. We'll be in Pacific saltwater, heading to the first island that we would be in the Pacific. Next slide. The Galapagos. Next slide. Where 99% of the land and the oceans is devoted to nature, people can only live and work in 1%. Think about that. That sounds like the right equation. Next slide. Our young would navigate to enter Polynesia, our ancestral home. Next slide. And Rapa Nui. And next slide. Then we would come home. It was exhausting, but amazing. And one of the CEOs from the local news stations would call me and say, "Hey, let's go have lunch." I sat down with him and he looked at me and said, you have no idea what Hokulea did. He said, first of all, this will be the largest viewership in Hawaii's history of any event. But he said, we knew that was going to happen. But he said what was most important was the vast majority, by counts of millions, the viewership wasn't from Hawaii. It was from elsewhere. So I know when you have the idea, people follow. Next slide. But the problem was, no matter what the impact was, the language is louder now, the projections are more clear, and they're time sensitive. Back with Lacey, they were still just a language of issues. Now it's a language of time. And so we got to go. We're bound to sail. Next slide. We're going to go again. We have a class that was created because the worldwide voyage called Malama Honua, means care for the earth. That is called the Navigators School. And it's in Hawaii. And we went to the high school students and said, go figure out where the center of the Pacific Ocean is. Draw a line from the Aleutians to Antarctica and Chile to China and tell us where is the center. And then take an elevation from that and go up vertical from the center of the Pacific until you can see the coastlines. How big is the Pacific? And so they come back to me and they go, and they say, 40,000. I said, no, you can fly in an airplane at 40,000 feet and you cannot see anything but water. He said, no, Nainoa, 40,000 miles. You got to go up. 1/5 of the way to the moon to see shoreline. The Pacific Ocean is, you can put all the terrestrial landmass of the whole earth in there. It's a universe to itself. Our focus on this next voyage, next slide, is to put a compass on the center, radiate, this is our traditional star compass taught by Mao, and radiate the star houses out and see where we go to. And so we're looking at a circumnavigation of the Pacific to protect the world's oceans, to protect life that we know it. And so it begins in Alaska. 21 different, it's a nation to itself, 21 different indigenous languages and so forth. And come down all the Americas, you go around clockwise. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. You begin with Alaska and you actually end in Russia. And so you spend 3 years. It's a 5-year educational campaign about nature. And it's all that kind of stuff. It says 44 months. We begin our education this spring. Next slide. Next slide. We're going to voyage. That's what we do. Next slide. For the oceans. Because we believe that if you want to protect the health of humanity, you have to protect the health of the earth. And you can't do that unless you protect the health of the oceans. This is a blue planet. It's a water planet. Follow the water. Next slide. Yep, it's about ecological beauty and the stress that we're under. Next slide, I'm going to go quick. And it's about science and technology, navigated by the right values, find the way. The innovation issues we need to figure out by essentially giving young people the ability to go explore. Next slide. And it's about indigenous knowledge. You know, the problem that we're having is that we forgot so much, but trying to uncover the layers and trying to understand the worldview of the indigenous people that had to live in some kind of relationship and kinship that they could survive long term. If they weren't able to accomplish that, they would be extinct. We think islanders have the environment to be the microcosm for the earth. There's 25,000 islands in the Pacific. Next slide. And this is the one that I think is the most important piece of planetary health, is the network and connections of the massive challenge that we have to bring together a community, global, that's defined by the values that we agree on and put the rest aside, because so much is at risk. It's this community that planetary health is now figuring it out. Look at 3 years, 48 countries, 180 memberships. That's light speed. All committed to an idea, not to an institution, not to an organization, but to an idea. And my belief is that every time, I believe that we're in the most extraordinary moment of time. Never like it before in humanity. Where there is a movement on earth, it's actually a race. A race of things that are destroying, and the race is trying to renew it. There is the greatest movement of humankind ever to do things that are good, that'll help build a better world. And people are doing it on their own, whether it's in classrooms or in the universities, in their backyard, in the watershed. They're doing it on their own. But I would argue, even though they're not all connected, every time someone does an act of kindness for the earth, they're doing it, yes, for their community, yes, for their family, but they're doing it for every one of us too. It's a matter of doing the arithmetic and adding it up. This notion of building this network, and it's already started. What is it going to be in 3 more years or 6 more years? It's going to be extraordinary. Next slide. And education. That's our thing. It's all about having children the tools, change the world. Next. And I'm going to leave you with a few slides. I know it's been long and you're tired. I need to drag you back to 1980 when I would do my first voyage as a student of Mao to Tahiti and back, 5,000-mile round trip. He would be, after the round trip, he would be in his bedroom at my parents' house where he lived for 28 months, never went home once, stayed with me. We were in the ocean every day. If I didn't go in the ocean that day, he'd make me jump off a cliff and swim in the black because you got to touch salt water. And it was immersion. He's going home for the first time, and he sits me down, and he's packing his little bag of clothes. He goes, "Okay, Nainoa, you did okay." Whoa, that was a long trip. But anyway, you did okay. And then he said, "I give you everything. The ocean showed you everything. It'll be 20 years before you see. You are too old. You want someone to know everything in navigation and the magic. Send your son. You're too old." Just think about this. He said his grandfather chose him to succeed his father's navigator. His grandfather's teacher on his island of Satawal. His grandfather, 1-year-old, would choose him and put him in tide pools on different parts of that 1-mile-long island to play with nature, to listen to the bird, feel sand, sound of the forest. And then, at a really old age of 5 years old, he was voyaging already on his grandfather's canoe. And he said, Mao tell me, yeah, I'm on the canoe with my grandfather. The wave make the canoe go up and down, and the wave make me sick. And he says, then my grandfather tie my hands and throw me overboard and drag me behind the canoe. Try to do that in the public school system. But he talked with just great love with his grandfather, and there's no abuse. He goes, yeah, my grandfather throw me in the ocean so I can go in the ocean. I can go in the ocean, then I can go inside the wave. When I go inside the wave, I become the wave. And when I become the wave, then I'm navigator. At 5, not at 22. You're too old. I understand it. I honor it. But what I honor too, when do we teach values? When do we teach connections? It's when they're young. The most important years for these children. But Mao makes me sense from that story that there's 2 things that are relevant to planetary health. You need the wave. And that's the movement that already exists. It just needs to be, the other thing you need the navigators. I believe in this room are navigators. I believe it's an issue of leadership. I believe the world wants to go to the right place. It needs navigators. I believe that this framework you talk about, Sam, planetary health, I would suggest it's both the va'a, the double-hull voyaging canoe, and it's the wave at the same time. Next slide. Become the wave. Then you become navigators. Next slide. And Lacey simply would say, he'd be joyous. He'd be honored that I would be here, his friend, humbled and grateful. And he would say, Nainoa, you keep your promise. And what he would say, if he saw the idea of planetary health, he would say, that's the place that has vision, believes. It has navigating by values that includes all. And it talks about respect, Native people, nature. And it also talks about the power of community. I just start to scale out what you guys are about to do globally. Bring together people around the vision and the values. And that they will have their own voyaging canoes to do what they need to do. And they'll be their own navigators changing the world. And the other is that what planetary health, Lacey would say, you have the sail plan. You have a sail plan. It's not going to be easy. But I saw these presentations. They're all about the sail plan of changing the world. What planetary health also has, it has courage. It has courage to believe. Quite frankly, I got to go. I got to do what I can with the canoe. That's all I got. But I can't get permission to take 400 people's lives out to sea for 44 months. I don't have permission from their parents or their children or their wives or their friends. Unless the voyage that we're going to take on Hokulea around the Pacific is going to have enough value that it's worth the risk. And I will leave you with this, because I am urgent. I'm intense. I don't sleep. I got 10-year-old twins. Every time I look into their eyes, they're trusting their father. My daughter asked me, what was Hawaii like before you changed the climate? Think about the question. Planetary health takes the notion that we can believe, that we can make a difference. Planetary health is the voyage that I'm going to follow, that we're going to follow. Without that permission, without that framework, without that vehicle, without the navigators, I don't know if we could be successful. So, on behalf of our voyagers, their families, our communities, the thousands, I'm humbled but grateful to be here. I'm grateful because you are showing us the way. And I have very good friends in Sam. And I have strangers that I don't know, but I can believe in. So on behalf of all those of my community, I just want to thank you for being here on the most important voyage of all time. And in this room are powerful, powerful navigators. They're going to be able to show the way for many. Thank you. Aloha.